Back at it, FT on Stadium with Braun Locane, Todd Father, and Tim Healey from Newsday, who covers the Mets, joining us right now. Tim, great to see you. Happy almost holidays. And let's get right into the non-story that you posted. That is a story last night for Newsday. So why is Pete Alonso not loved by the Mets right now?
Well, I don't know it's that they don't love him, but as I reported, there just haven't been any contract extension negotiations to this point in the offseason. At the beginning of the offseason, the negotiators on both sides turned over, right? Pete Alonso hired Scott Boras, and the Mets hired David Stearns. So those parties, the new parties, just haven't talked about it. And that could be for a few reasons. One is those sorts of talks don't really happen usually until January, February, maybe March leading up to opening day. But then the other is the very real possibility that an extension just does not happen this offseason, and both sides are comfortable letting 2024 play out however it does, the season and then Alonso's free agency. So to this point, what we know is no talks between Alonso and the Mets, and I'm not super confident that that's going to change soon.
Now, from covering Pete for the 5-6 years that he's been there, I don't know exactly. Does he have that feel that he wants to stay in New York? Do you have that feeling that, is he not afraid to go anywhere else, or does he love it in New York like it seems?
Well, he likes New York. He says all the right things about liking New York. But for not just Pete, but for anybody, I think you kind of can't help but wonder what might be out there for you professionally, financially, personally, living in a new city, a new part of the country. I think Pete likes New York plenty, but that's not necessarily going to, that doesn't mean necessarily that there's only one team in his heart of hearts. You know what I mean?
What
Go ahead, Lo, you good?
All right. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. Well, the question I have is, do we have another Ohtani situation playing out where he neither gets signed or traded? I can't see that happening again.
It's quite likely that, if the Mets don't sign Alonso to an extension before the season, it's going to be his free agent year, which will raise the interesting possibility that if the Mets aren't in at the trade deadline, maybe they trade him. The risk they run with that, of course, would be, even though they could always re-sign Alonso into that scenario, when guys get traded and see what it's like elsewhere, sometimes it opens their eyes to, wow, actually, life is okay in a new city, in a city other than the only one I've ever known. So that will be an interesting storyline over the first half of the season. But I think back to what Steve Cohen said in August after the trade deadline when he was asked about Alonso and his contract and an extension. He referenced Brandon Nimmo, and Brandon Nimmo hired Scott Boras going into his last season before free agency, had a very good year, did not get a contract extension, reached free agency, did the whole meetings with other team thing, and then came back to the Mets. So that kind of feels like the most likely option right now here with Pete Alonso.
Let me ask you this. I want to jump to Yamamoto real quick. Seems like this is, besides Ohtani, this is the guy that a lot of teams are on right now, especially in New York. You think about the Yankees and Mets. Stearns made a trip to meet with him, along with Steve Cohen, I think, too, as well, if I'm not mistaken. What did you get from that? And do you think the Mets are gung-ho? This is the guy we got to shake down and get right now.
What I made of it is that, yes, they're absolutely gung-ho. Yamamoto is plan A. He would be the biggest ticket of their offseason, the biggest addition of their offseason. But that's true for a lot of teams. The Yankees really want him, and their fan base really wants him. Red Sox and their fans, Dodgers and their fans, depending on how the Ohtani stuff sorts out. So Yamamoto is going to really cash in. He's going to get by far the biggest contract of any Japanese player coming to the United States, and it's going to be interesting because if the Mets don't land Yamamoto, I'm not sure that they're going to be after the other elite starting pitchers on the market. Blake Snell, 2-time Cy Young Award winner. Jordan Montgomery had a great year last year, especially in the playoffs. Those guys are going to get big deals. I'm just not sure that the Mets are going to be big players for them. So a lot of their hopes ride on Yamamoto. He's only 25 years old, so he fits their timeline perfectly. A little bit of a reset in 2024 before really trying to win in 25 and 26 and beyond. So a lot of the Mets offseason plan rides on Yamamoto. They should know within the next week or two whether they get plan A or whether they need to more earnestly pursue plans B and C.
So let's talk this out. And Gary Sheffield Jr. is trying to scoop people, but he basically said, and we can show the tweet in a second here. There it is. Reports are saying Yamamoto, quote, wants the biggest stage. The biggest stage resides in New York, and it ain't in Queens. Money talks in most cases, but if what he says is true, he's in pinstripes, rocking number 18 in April. Do you feel, covering the Mets, that they are very much second fiddle for a player if he is in a similar money range? I also think that even if the Mets feel like they do need to offer more, their purse is bigger.
Yeah. Well, their purse is definitely bigger. They are the richest baseball team in New York City, that's for sure. But to Gary Sheffield Jr.'s point, the Mets aren't the sexiest brand in New York City, right? The Yankees are far more iconic, far more winning historically, all that stuff. We know that. So as much as the Steve Cohen era is supposed to be a new era, level of playing field in that respect, you know, they can't compete if a guy really, truly values the pinstripes, the Yankees logo, all that stuff, the tradition. Then no, the Mets cannot compete on that level. They can compete, though, financially. And it depends on what Steve Cohen really wants when it comes down to it. Because he has the ability to blow away the Yankees and anybody else looking to sign Yamamoto with the contract offer. It's just a matter of, is he really going to go over the top on that offer, or is he kind of trying to stay a little more even keel with that after a couple of eventful years?
All right, let's bring in Todd Father actually for this one too. So, Todd, you played for the Yanks and for the Mets. Is it real? If everything was pretty much the same, do you think Yamamoto says, I like that Yankee tradition and everything else? Plus, I mean, right now, I would say percentage chance of Yankees versus Mets making the playoffs, if that's important to him on the short term, I would think so. What do you think, Todd Father? You've got both sides here.
On the spot.
I don't mind at all. I think it is true. I think there's a certain tradition in the Bronx compared to Queens. I mean, from playing from both teams, I get that question all the time. Like, what's the difference? Well, it's just sometimes in Queens, as Tim knows, I've had it out with some reporters, you know, during the seasons and stuff. It seems like, no offense to Tim or those guys, but they're looking always for the juice, always trying to find the problem. You know what I mean? And in New York, it's, you know, there's problems, but guess what? They don't. It's just a different way of going about it. And some things get swept under the rug, some don't. But the tradition in New York, when it comes to the Bronx, it's winning. It's going in there, you know, shaving your face. People talk about shaving their face. Maybe that's a problem, but it's just something that is just different from everybody else. You're held to a higher standard. And I think that's where I'm getting at when it comes to that, Tim.
Can I make one point here, though, on the media side, and a question, I guess, too? Because,
Sure.
I mean, you do get a lot of the same media that'll crisscross and go to both Yanks and Mets. You were there for Wilpon era, right? You weren't there when Cohen was owning the team. In my mind, and Tim, you can help me out here, too, I think the way that things have been conducted so far with the new group, as they still also take on a ball club, and I've learned about this too, and you're an organization with hundreds of employees, you can't just take over a team and like fire everyone. You go through an evolution, a process. You know, where are the problems? Where can we get better? And that even includes their president of baseball operations now in David Stearns. I think there was more drama created by the previous regime on a daily basis in terms of how they were running the team. And that also led to a lot more drama with the Mets. Is that fair?
I'd say so.
I would say so. I mean, Yeah, I give a prime example of Noah Syndergaard, man. Or, what's his name? The Dark Knight. I'm just drawing a
Oh,
blank.
Harvey?
Harvey. Like
Yep.
two guys that all of a sudden one thing went wrong, and next thing you know, it's like anytime they pitched, there was something else. Like, and you know, sometimes they put it on themselves. Don't get me wrong, but it was like it was there was a lot more people in those in their lockers. You know, usually when it came to after they were done pitching or when something was going on. Tim, what do you think?
I think the idea of the Steve Cohen Mets being cleaner, running a tighter ship, all of that stuff, as opposed to the Wilpon Mets, is in a lot of ways still just theoretical because it's been 3 years since Steve Cohen bought the team, and it's been really eventful, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in bad ways. They've had turnover at manager still, turnover at GM. You know, so there has been a learning curve for the Steve Cohen Mets that I think he has figured out or is figuring out. And now they've got David Stearns, they've got Carlos Mendoza. So it's another fresh start. And maybe this one sticks and is more like what people thought was going to happen when Steve Cohen bought the team. But yes, the Wilpon Mets were absolutely chaotic. And so the Steve Cohen Mets have also been chaotic, but maybe a little less so. And moving forward, probably much less so, I would guess.
Yeah, and I want to jump off there. Like, what changes have you seen since Stearns has taken over, if any? Like, have you seen any differences? The way he goes about, you know, being one of the top guys in the organization.
Well, it's a small sample size still, so we're still figuring it out. You know, we have to see what spring training looks like, see what a losing streak or mediocre season looks like, things like that. But he, in trying to apply his Brewers experience, that wisdom to the Mets, it's been interesting. I think whereas the Mets of the recent past under Epler and Cohen were gung-ho, all in on free agency, win immediately, try to buy a championship, all that stuff with Scherzer, Verlander, etc. That didn't work out. So this is a little bit of a reset. Stearns is able to spend a lot more money, of course, with the Mets than he did with the Brewers, but I think he's still going to be selective in that. And that's why, even if they're not all in on 2024, Yamamoto, for example, only 25 years old, is an exception. And it seems like, frankly, it seems like they have to do a better job of not leaking stuff, which is always, I think, a good thing for a front office, even though it's a bad thing for reporters covering the team. It makes it harder, of course. So I credit them for that. They operated almost entirely in secrecy on the manager search front throughout October. There were very little leaks to come out of that. But overall, I think the David Stearns Mets and his front office is still evolving. Roster-wise, definitely. Front office, he's made several key additions, and that group is, coming together, gelling together.
Yeah, Todd, that's a good point on Stearns. I wanted to ask about Stearns as well because, you know, him moving to the Mets, you know, I assumed that he would be more aggressive because he has more money to spend, you know, with Milwaukee. So now, you know, it's good to see that he's kind of bringing that, you know, build through the farm system kind of mentality to New York, as well as going out to get free agency. So that's good to see. But if they're able to get Yamamoto, do you think this becomes a playoff team?
I think they need more than Yamamoto. The bar that the Mets have set for themselves is to be competitive, right? And that's sort of a general term. David Stearns did say, though, in October that he expects competitive in 2024 for the Mets to mean competing for a playoff spot. And given the expanded playoffs these days, that's sort of a low bar. You know, you can be in the mid to low 80s win total and feasibly be in the playoff race into and through September. But I think the Mets are going to need more than Yamamoto. They need to hit another hitter, especially in the outfield, maybe at DH. They need to rebuild most of a bullpen behind Edwin Diaz and Brooks Raley. So there's plenty of work to do. This is not a one player away sort of situation, but they can get there over the course of the offseason, absolutely.
So you look at the Diamondbacks making the playoffs and then making it to the World Series, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I always mention this on our show, how, they had the talks with Verlander and Scherzer kind of saying like, we might not be good next year. But the thing that I keep thinking is if they do land Yamamoto, I think they do a few other things like you mentioned, especially on the pitching side. And can they be a wild card team at 84 wins like the Diamondbacks were? I mean, the Mets coming off what most people would say is a brutal season, won 75 games.
Yeah.
No Edwin Diaz. Yamamoto, if he's a 1. Kodai Senga right now looks like a really legit 2 in the bigs. And then you fill out the rest of that rotation. Some of the dudes on offense bounce back a little bit, like a Jeff McNeil. I don't know. I think that could be a wild card team. I could see them being better than the Marlins. Marlins made the playoffs too.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry to the Marlins, but I hope the Mets are better than the Marlins in 2024. It's totally possible if things fall the right way, which is very easy to imagine because of some of the guys that they have. You can pencil in Alonso for 40 homers and 100 RBIs. Lindor has coming off a great season. McNeil, I'm very comfortable saying he'll bounce back after a down year last year and a batting title the year before. Starling Marte was basically nothing last year, and they think he's healthy now, so we'll see. The young players, I think Francisco Alvarez is going to take another step up. So, yes, there are a lot of reasons to be positive on the Mets. At this still sort of early, maybe middle stage of the offseason where they do have several gaping holes, and Yamamoto certainly would fill the biggest of those holes right at the top of the rotation. And you mentioned the Diamondbacks. They're a great example. The Phillies the year before. It really speaks to the idea of if you just get in, anything can happen. Anybody can get hot in October. And that's, I think, sort of the Mets' approach in 2024. They're not going to go all in. They're not going to win 100 games. But they could be pretty good and then see what happens.
What, in your opinion, besides, pitching depth, what other pieces do you feel that they need to add to make this team a playoff team? Because do they have any guys coming through the farm system that you can think of, or what other pieces can they add to help this team to get to where they need to be?
The biggest thing they need to add on the position player side is an outfielder. Right now, left field is open. They're not going to put any of their real young guys there. Jeff McNeil is primarily a second baseman, David Stearns said this week. So left field is the biggest gap. It could be interesting, though, if they took Brandon Nimmo, who has turned himself in recent years into a very strong center fielder, and moved him to left and signed a very good center fielder like, say, Kevin Kiermaier. I really like that idea. It's sort of, honestly, I can't get the idea out of my head because I love the idea in theory. No, nothing against Nimmo, who's awesome. But if you had a center fielder in left, which is pretty big at Citi Field, and a center fielder in center, then you're cooking with gas a little bit. You're going to catch a lot of fly balls that way. So I think a move like that could go a long way. Or they could just go with a bat first left fielder, and that would improve the team too. But figuring out the outfield, adding a legitimate option there would go a long way towards shoring up the defense and the lineup.
Yeah, I have said this, basically since the offseason started, and just the way some things, didn't go their way. I think the Mets, I mean, obviously with Yamamoto, I think it's a lock, but I think they win more games than they did last year. Now, the difference between 77 and 87, obviously, is the playoffs, something like that. But let's take it to the Yanks for a sec here, because I liked your little tidbit on Soto and how that trade came together. So I'll read it from you yesterday. A great example of the impact and importance of organizational depth. After the 2017 season, the Yanks had a bit of a 40-man crunch. Too many worthwhile players, not enough spots. Good problem to have. They cleared 2 spots, dealing Garrett Cooper and Caleb Smith to the Marlins for Michael King. And they didn't have room for those guys. Not a big transaction at the time. 6 years later, big part of the Soto deal. So do you think we're undercovering moves like that sometimes? And I'm not even talking like player by player. I'm more saying it seems to me that there are a group of teams that often have that crunch, and this is what they do, right? There's the same teams that have the 40-man crunch, and they trade number of players for one higher upside prospect or player, And then that's where a lottery ticket like this works out later on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Yankees are a great example of a team, an organization that is able to do that. And they get undercovered because they're not sexy moves at the time, right? I remember that trade very much sticks out to me because I was covering the Marlins at the time. And I liked Michael King, who had just had a really solid season in the lower minors. Wasn't a huge prospect, but it was like, okay, this is a New England guy. I like New England guys. Curious to see what he becomes. Then he gets traded to the Yankees in the deal before the Stanton Marlins deal. And I just always have enjoyed following his career. And Garrett Cooper and Caleb Smith, to their credit and to the Marlins' credit, were pretty solid players for Miami for a few years. And then little Michael King ends up being not only a really good pitcher for the Yankees in recent years, but then the key piece in the Juan Soto trade, which is just kind of mind blowing. So it's not a very sexy thing, but it is a testament to an organization's pro scouting, drafting, player development, all of that largely behind the scenes stuff that really truly moves the needle in ways other than just developing superstars, right? It matters in more subtle ways than, in the Yankees example, they have Volpe and Dominguez, right? Those are probably going to look like big player development wins, big internal wins. But then there's also this smaller stuff too that doesn't get noticed as much.
Yeah, and the Yankees have made a lot of trades. Now, they've whiffed on some of those trades, but many teams can't make the volume of trades like that without completely collapsing their farm system, and that they have not done. So it's a good call. Tim, thanks for joining us, man. Happy Ohtani Day, maybe to you, hopefully to you, so that we can move on to the rest of the free agent process and also talk about this and not on like Saturday at 2 a.m. So appreciate you, man. Have a nice weekend.